All right, today we're going on an incredible journey through the making of modern India. We're going to trace the forces from way back in ancient times all the way to today that have shaped one of the most complex and honestly fascinating societies on Earth. And really, this whole exploration, it all boils down to one single massive question. What does it actually mean to be Indian? It's a question that hits you when you see just how diverse Indian society is. And to even start to unpack that, we've got to go way, way back.
Just look at this. It gives you a real sense of the scale we're talking about, right? India isn't just a country, it's a full-blown civilization. Its roots go back thousands of years, creating this incredibly pluralistic society. So, let's dive in.
So let's start at the beginning in ancient and medieval India. This is where the foundational ideas about everything, religion, society, life itself, first took shape. It's the cultural bedrock that, in many ways, is still there today. Okay, so here's a quick roadmap for this first part of our journey. We're starting with the ancient Harappan civilization, moving through the Vedic period, all the way up to the medieval period. Each of these eras represents a major, major shift. We tend to think of these big, planned cities as a modern thing, right? But check this out. Thousands of years ago, the Harappan civilization was building these unbelievably sophisticated urban centers. I mean, they had advanced stuff like covered drainage systems and huge granaries. That points to a really developed society. So after the Harappans, we get to the Vedic period. And this is a really crucial turning point. This is the era that introduces the core spiritual and social structures of Hinduism, which would go on to shape the entire subcontinent for centuries. At the heart of this worldview were the four aims of life, the Purusharthas. You can kind of think of them as a practical guide for living a full life. It starts with dharma, which is your duty. Then you have artha, making a living ethically. Then kama, or pleasure. And finally, the ultimate goal, moksha, liberation from the whole cycle of rebirth. Now, the Vedic period also brought in a social organization system called the Varna system. As it says here, it was initially a flexible classification based on what you did for a living. Priests, warriors, merchants, laborers. And that word initially is super important. It wasn't necessarily some rigid system you were born into.
But, and this is a huge but, things started to change. Over time, that flexible Varna system hardened into what we know as the rigid hereditary jati, or caste system. This new system was based on ideas of purity and pollution, which basically meant your social standing was locked in at birth. This created these really strict social boundaries that would define Indian society for centuries.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about the status of women, because the story here is just, well, it's a dramatic change. It might actually surprise you to learn that in the early Vedic period, women could reach a very high status. They had access to education, and some were even famous scholars. And this right here, this shows you the change perfectly. Look at the left, the early Vedic period. Women had access to education, they could choose their own husbands. But then look at the later Vedic period on the right. Education, denied. Marriage became their only option, and child marriage started becoming common. It was a huge social step backwards. All right, moving into the medieval period, India goes through another massive transformation with the arrival of new faiths. The spread of Islam, especially, led to this amazing cultural blend. You can see it in architecture, in language, in how things were run. It gave rise to this unique Indo-Islamic culture that really flourished. And that brings us to the next massive shift, the colonial period. The arrival of European powers and then the establishment of British rule would completely re-engineer Indian society in ways that, frankly, are still being felt today. So, the British brought in totally new systems of governance. They set up a centralized administration, a new economic system, and as you can see from this picture, they also introduced a secular judiciary. In theory, this meant everyone was equal before the law, no matter their caste or religion. But one of the most lasting impacts of British rule was probably in education. English became the main language of instruction, and secular subjects were brought into the curriculum. This created a whole new class of Western-educated Indians. And the irony is, it was the very values they learned, rationality, social justice, that they'd later use to challenge colonial rule itself. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. The 19th century saw this explosion of social reform movements. This new educated class of Indians started to look at their own society and challenge these long-standing traditions, like the caste system and the poor treatment of women. And here, you can see some of the big ones, the key players in these reform movements. You've got Rajaram Mohan Roy and his Brahmo Samaj, which focused on religious reform. Jyotiba Phule's Satyashodak Samaj fought for the rights of lower castes. And of course, later on, Mahatma Gandhi's Harijan Sevak Sangh worked to end untouchability. These were Indians trying to reform their own society from within. And the thing is, these movements weren't just talk. They had a real, tangible impact. They put enough pressure on the British administration to pass some landmark laws. You can see here, the Sati Act in 1829 outlawed widow burning. In 1856, the Widow Remarriage Act gave women new rights. And in 1929, an act set a minimum age for marriage. This was social reform becoming law. Okay, that leads us right into our final chapter, post-independent India. After a long, hard struggle, India gained independence in 1947. And now, it faced this monumental task of building a new identity as a modern, sovereign nation. So, what was the bedrock of this new nation? It was its constitution. Adopted in 1950, this document laid out the blueprint for what would become the world's largest democracy. It promised justice, liberty, and equality to every single one of its citizens. And you have to understand, this new political system was absolutely revolutionary for its time. It established the world's most populous democracy, all based on free and fair elections. Every adult got the right to vote. Everyone was declared equal in the eyes of the law. Those old aristocratic titles, gone. It was a radical break from the past. And, well, that brings us right up to today. The journey we've just traced, from ancient philosophies and rigid social rules, through colonialism and internal reform, to creating a modern democracy, it's still going on. Modern India is this constant, dynamic balancing act between its deep, ancient past and its ambitious future. So we kind of end where we started, but hopefully now with a much deeper understanding. The story of India is one of continuity and change, of unbelievable diversity, and this constant search for a shared identity. The question that's left is, how will this ancient civilization keep balancing all these forces as it carves out its path into the future?